Host, please welcome the former Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, now the extraordinary and plenipotentiary Ambassador of Ukraine to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Valerii Zaluzhnyi. Mr. Valerii, good morning. Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. Glad to see and hear you all. You can see and hear us well. Thank you for finding time so early. Thank you. Mr. Valerii, I have a personal question for you first. We met somehow, I can't remember, a year ago. You were working here in an ultra-intensive format, probably with emotional overloads, and that's obvious. Now you are in London. How do you feel about such a dissonance in emotions? And what is your impression? Do British officials understand what Ukraine is going through now? Siri Mazutsky, once again, good morning. Thank you very much to everyone. It's actually a very interesting question, especially regarding this transition from one, let's say, one type of activity to another. Well, let's say it is really hard, especially for a military person who has devoted almost their entire life to military service and is in constant stress. To change the type of activity, well, Volodymyr Dantes, very, very difficult. But thanks to the fact that it happened this way, that all my life I was learning, trying to gain something new and try myself in something new, this process went absolutely painlessly for me. And as of today, I absolutely feel in, let's say, my element. The first thing concerning British officials, perhaps first of all, it should be said that Britain is a very democratic country with a very developed, very good and long history of democracy. And when we talk about British officials, let's always remember that British officials are absolutely represent the British people and absolutely convey exactly what the British people think and want. So what I want to say is that despite the fact that it is generally difficult to perceive a conflict or especially a war in a country that is very far away. Well, for example, I've always tried to draw an analogy with how I, for example, perceived the war that was going on between Iran and Iraq there in 1980 to 1988. Of course, it was interesting to see what was happening there. Well, maybe, but to worry a lot and greatly influence something, that's difficult. In Britain, it's the opposite. It's a unique country, I believe, and first of all, we should thank our diaspora, which has very, very strong roots here, Fedorovich, and a very strong influence. Britain is fully involved in this process. It not only empathizes, but also demands from its leadership absolutely correct decisions that Ukraine needs. Therefore, I believe that today, the British government, by the way, look, what's interesting, not only the government and the opposition, it is a rare phenomenon when we have absolute support from both the current government and the opposition, which, by the way, is absolutely different here as well. And another different political force is emerging. But my answer to this question is absolutely confident. I absolutely believe it should not be interpreted otherwise. Yes, I believe that both Britain and British officials absolutely understand what is happening in Ukraine. Moreover, they not only understand, but also, I would say, do quite a lot for this. Andrei Yamak, yesterday there were somewhat shocking statements in the evening from American President Donald Trump regarding the fact that Ukraine shouldn't have started the war. We know who started the war. Have you had time or the opportunity to get any reaction from the British? What are they saying in London about this? Look, London's position, despite the statements coming from across the ocean, the position of the United Kingdom remains unchanged, as stated by government officials of the United States of America. By the way, this was said both before these recent statements and after they were made. Well, the British government and the British people absolutely support Ukraine and remain on the side of Ukraine. That's good. How would you describe the trajectory of the Ukraine-Russia war as a former commander-in-chief? Where is everything heading, and what point might it reach in 6 months to a year? Host, look, I never wanted to be work there at the level of some host, a person who tries to project, the future and guess something there about the future, I can say this. Look, let's look at this war from two perspectives. Well, the first is technological. Ferenc, I think we have the right to introduce the topic concerning the technology of the war itself. It is, let's say, closer to me as someone who has been directly involved in this for a long time. What I want to say is that in order to Fedor, to continue fighting, let alone winning, the first thing needed is weapons. These weapons must be adequate and correspond to the conditions in which the war takes place. Well, for example, we cannot fight with bows and arrows against tanks, cannons, and so on. Venskovsky, what is happening today? A very interesting phenomenon is occurring today, where it is actually a bit difficult to find this parity. A bit difficult. Why? Because technologies are developing. Technologies bring changes in forms and methods of application, and as a consequence require changes in organization. I am talking about the fact that from the perspective of weapon availability, yes, we understood that these are unmanned systems, these are control systems, these are situational awareness systems, but today, again, we are seeing the emergence of the same things, and accordingly from the other side. In order to defeat the opponent, ultimately, you need to gain an advantage. What do we see today? We see today that, as of today, we are somewhat lagging in matters, perhaps, of technological development, specifically in the use of unmanned systems on fiber optics. They indeed give the Russians an advantage today. We are currently unable to achieve widespread use of such weapons as guided aerial bombs or defend against them. Accordingly, this also gives the Russians a certain advantage. Well, thirdly, we cannot afford to use the amount of human resources that the Russian Federation has and pay the price for those minor victories they currently have, precisely due to the combination of these three components. Ferenc, we have a slight advantage in technology due to the use of guided aerial bombs, which have reached a mass scale and ultimately matter, and the use of human resources. How this will develop further in terms of warfare technology, we will see. Watch. Second, let's now look at a more serious issue from a more, let's say, political perspective on the war process. How is it then been? Political been extreme there, and the extreme form of the political process. Stop. War is possible, and it will definitely lead to victory when the people defending this country are ready to continue defending it. This is very important. Let's ask ourselves, what are we doing about this? Volodymyr Zelensky, second, there must be reliable and ongoing international support. Let's ask ourselves questions and predict what will happen in 6 months. We must have adequate military leadership so that this leadership could develop the right strategy, the only correct strategy for this or that war, for ours in this case. Well, and fourth, this whole process needs effective management. So, well, let's ask ourselves questions on each of these points and see what will happen with this in 6 months. And you mentioned Russian losses. I wanted to ask you about this. You once said that you believed that when Russia reaches 100,000 losses, it might become a threshold that this country does not want to cross. And it's clear that I think the entire civilized world, and I too, am surprised to how ready Russia is to expand its male population. Do you now think there is a limit to losses in Russia? And do you see any signs that such massive losses are having some effect on the army and the political leadership of this Russia, this country? Yes, you are right. I was absolutely sure that the more losses we inflict, their losses, the Russian army and Russia, and these losses will eventually force them to abandon further actions. But that was entirely my mistake, because even today we see that well, it is more likely that the human resource for Russia is, well, probably not the cheapest. And at least we can state the fact that Russia definitely does not consider human losses and is ready to achieve its goals even through the heaviest losses, through the loss of people. Therefore, this must be taken into account. This must be taken into account, and perhaps a forgot. Inflicting maximum losses on the enemy today remains relevant, but it is definitely not the key for, yes, and ultimately to achieve victory. I want to ask you about something. You, being the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, once wrote an article It seems to me that in the ekonomiska sa nemaše nuzalizi tepu, it was mentioned that neither side can win militarily unless a new powder of war is invented. At the end of the third year of the full-scale war, do you see the outlines of this new powder? Volodymyr Zelensky, look, everything is absolutely, let's say, simple. If you look at it from a historical perspective and from the perspective of the development of armed struggle, I may be mistaken, many may argue with me, but look at what happens. Let's look at the First World War. World War I was the emergence of tanks and combat aviation. This is what could change the situation on the battlefield. But the problem was that the sides fighting in that war developed, let's say, in parallel to each other. And this led to the fact that ultimately they returned to that stalemate that was in the First World War. And we understand how it will all end. Accordingly, if we look further, weapons developed, and the next big leap we can probably see somewhere at the beginning of the 70s when precision weapons appeared and guided munitions emerged. Yes, this is what allowed gaining some advantage. And this advantage was successfully used there both in Afghanistan and during the war in Iraq. But the situation changed there, I think the mid-1990s when remarkable use of space appeared in its three aspects, so to speak, main ones. Earth surveillance, GPS, and space communication. It brought to the battlefield the so-called high-precision weapon management system, HOST. So we basically went through the year 2022 when the war started. We were somewhat in disparity. That is, to put it simply, I always give a basic example. We all had iPhones, us and the Russians. The Russians, of course, had more of them, but this allowed us to achieve some victories due to greater organization, better preparation, and greater patriotic persistence. And so we went through the 23rd year when this situation changed, because on the battlefield, then first electronic warfare means appeared, which neutralized weapons platforms, means of destruction, for example, like HIMARS. And on the other hand, there appeared a huge number of aerial and strike reconnaissance vehicles that have just, so to speak, occupied the sky to this day. Those very aircraft created a so-called dead zone where it is almost impossible to approach the line of contact, nearly impossible to fight there, and even impossible to evacuate the wounded and dead because actions are mocked. These drones in the air are controlling everything now. That's why I mentioned that this new thing which can bring a radical change to this war has to be this new powder in the form of these technologies. In the form of technologies which will have a whole we recently conducted their analysis there in different ways. A small discourse like this, we counted 17 separate points that could be included in the word technologies. These technologies can change and alter the situation on the battlefield, and they must change Ukraine. I believe it has every chance because, as you correctly said, the laboratories are located in Kyiv. It's a pity that not yet in research institutes, but rather in some other places. Serhiy Kovtonyuk, mostly probably in garages, but still we are moving towards this. Alexander Kokol. Well, yes, I didn't even say that. It was a report from an American company which wrote that I was impressed by such a comparison, that the Silicon Valley of military technology is now not in California, but in Kyiv. And continuing with technologies, I was surprised when I recently found out that 85%, Serhiy Bodnar, % of losses for the Russians are caused by our drones. I thought 30, 20, 40, 85, if they didn't deceive us. Alexander Kolemsin, Vasil Maluk asked me, how ready are our Western partners for the war of the future? And how ready are they to help us in such a future war? I will share absolutely my opinion. By no means want to offend our partners, and by no means do I want to encourage them to any actions, but at the same time I conduct such constantly work. I provide many illustrative examples, constantly share Serhiy Pehuda, by what is happening on the battlefield. My answer is no, and unfortunately as of today, let's say, our partners remained in the state of February 24, 2022, despite the fact that it was already the summer of 2023, which radically changed the entire situation on the battlefield and incidentally changed the rules of warfare. They became completely new. But as of today, let's say no. But it's important not to forget that this is still a war of a transitional period. Still, we need to be very, very careful. When we talk about numbers, even 85%. We need to be quite careful with this. Why? Because we don't see everything yet. We see only a small effect and want to see it as a system. A lot of work will still need to be done for this. Partners have advanced technologies in precision weaponry. They have space technology, something Ukraine still does not have. These technologies can work in the future, and also considering that we are expecting a huge boost specifically from artificial intelligence. Therefore, we must constantly remember our partners and always act in a way that directs their scientific achievements and technologies specifically for our victory. But for now, let's say they remain there on the 24th of February 2022, just like that, because it's not just about adopting unmanned systems, it's about trying out a new tactic, new strategy, new doctrine, trying out a new organization, building production around it, training, and so on and so on. Two last questions. It seems that the existential confrontation with Russia is long-term for us. There is no doubt about this, I think, for anyone in this room. What needs to change in the Ukrainian army, and what size should it be to resist the aggressor and prevent a new war? Because it looks like the question about NATO is not on the table right now. Volodymyr Zelensky, look, I absolutely believe that only the armed forces of Ukraine are, Volodymyr Zelensky, they were, or rather are, and will be the most reliable guarantor of Ukraine's security. They will still be the foundation, whether they will be ours or not, but these are the armed forces of Ukraine. Secondly, in order to look at the armed forces of Ukraine, again, we need to look very carefully at the technology of military development itself. And it is very simple. First, a technical model or a technical solution emerges. After that, forms, methods, tactics of application inevitably emerge. Only after this does organization arise, but not the other way around. It's a very long process. We need to look not only at the technical achievements we have and the tactics we are currently developing. The main thing for us is to identify trends where this is heading. And these trends tell us that most likely, well, the future war and future armed conflicts will be slightly different. Most likely, after all, demographics and the economic state and the economic condition will compel future participants in wars, conflicts to first and foremost protect people and count their money. Volodymyr Zelensky. And this means that the war will be conducted with inexpensive means, most likely robots, which will bring maximum effect. So we are talking about the so-called war of attrition as a new form of warfare. And then we have to look at the armed forces of Ukraine from this perspective. How will they defend themselves from this new war of attrition of robots? And how will they manage all this? It's a long process, and in 2 or 3 days, well, unfortunately, it cannot be resolved. For this, it will be necessary, I say again, for it to work. Volodymyr Zelensky, to work preferably in special scientific institutions with the involvement of our partners. Alexander Kachalinsky, and what in your opinion should be the size of the Ukrainian army? Right now it's about 900,000, I believe. How would you estimate perhaps from to or approximate numbers? Look, I have a very, let's say, unpleasant answer to this question. Let's discuss Ukraine first, okay? So for some reason, I am sure that and the size of, let's say, Ukraine will absolutely depend on how many people are willing to defend it. So if we are again directly discussing the conduct of the war now, the very war now, well, one must be very cautious, very cautious. Why? Because the armed forces of Ukraine should not, let's say, be the armed forces of Ukraine, and the Ukrainian state must stand separate from them. The main thing for the armed forces of Ukraine is the number of prepared mobilization resources and the number of people ready in case of yesterday take up arms, like it was in the year 2022, and place them for its protection. So the situation may vary, situations may arise. Perhaps now calculations can be made, and we will understand with you that half might be enough from that, you see. What is present. I'm not ready to talk about it. It's something that needs calculation. And the most important thing is to have it here, in the territory of Ukraine. the number of prepared mobilization resources specifically for the prolonged war we see now. Therefore, it will all depend on the specific situation we eventually face to respond to one threat or another. But again, I want to tell you this. From the state's perspective, I would focus more on, well, on Ukraine directly as a future mobilization resource, its readiness for defense, Volodymyr Proskurian, and not the number that might be directly in the armed forces, which, by the way, will depend this number on many factors. Thank you. I know the last question, I know you don't like and don't want to talk about Ukrainian politics, elections and so on. That's probably not right, okay. But here the whole hall wants me to ask you one last question. Valerii Fedorovich, will you go? People are smiling. Look, in order to answer this question, let's first establish the conditions under which such a question will be absolutely, well, appropriate. Well, I believe so. These conditions will come. Then I, as a person who is in public service, directly working for the state, will be ready to answer such questions. For now, our only task is to stand firm and preserve our state. And after that, we will think about others. Thank you very much, Mr. Valerii. Thank you for your time and for joining us. This was the former Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Ukraine's ambassador to the United Kingdom, Valerii Zaluzhnyi. Thank you.